Introduction. A love built on lies. Jacob Sterling thought he had it all. A beautiful home in the heart of Austin, a successful career, and a marriage to a woman who, for the longest time, was his entire world. He'd built his life with Lauren, his wife, brick by brick. Together, they'd crafted the perfect picture, one that everyone envied. But beneath the surface, everything was slowly falling apart. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. Lauren, the woman he knew better than anyone, started slipping away. Late nights, unexplained absences, moments of distance that didn't seem to make sense. Jacob, the man who had always trusted his instincts, couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But what could it be? First, Jacob tried to brush it off. Life was busy, right? Careers demanding more time, friendships shifting. Maybe he was overthinking it. But one night, everything changed. In a quiet, still moment, Jacob stumbled upon a truth that shattered the image of his perfect life. A positive pregnancy test. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The child couldn't be his. The unraveling began. Now, Jacob's world is in pieces. As he confronts the reality of Lauren's betrayal, he's caught between the love he still feels for her and the gut-wrenching truth that she has lied to him in the most unimaginable way. The storm inside him grows. But instead of confronting her directly, Jacob does what anyone in his position might do. He starts digging, searching for answers in places that leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and the life they'd built together. But one thing is clear. Jacob isn't just looking for answers. He's looking for justice, for the truth to come to light no matter the cost. This is the story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the intense emotional journey of a man who thought he had everything, until he realized he was living in a house built on lies. As the tension rises and secrets threaten to destroy everything, Jacob faces a choice. Continue living in the dark or confront the painful truth and find the strength to rebuild or break completely. Welcome to A Husband's Vengeance, a tale of betrayal and justice. This is where the perfect love story begins to unravel, and the real question becomes, who will survive the fallout? Chapter 1, Seeds of Doubt. Jacob sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty space next to him. Lauren, his wife of 8 years, had already left for the morning, her absence a silent reminder of the distance growing between them. She had always been the heart of their home, the bright and driven force that had built their life together. But now that same warmth seemed to be fading. What had once been a marriage of mutual understanding and trust was now filled with uncertainty. It all started so subtly. Jacob had never been the paranoid type. He trusted Lauren, believed in their bond. But over the past few months, small things had started to change. Lauren's late nights at the gym, the long hours spent working with clients, the vague answers when he asked about her day, each new instance planted a seed of doubt in Jacob's mind. At first, he pushed those thoughts away. After all, it wasn't unusual for her to be busy with work. She had always been ambitious. He admired that about her. But it wasn't just the long hours that bothered him. It was her behavior when she was home. She seemed distant, almost preoccupied. The closeness they once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by an unsettling silence that loomed between them. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But what could it be? Was he just imagining things? Was he overthinking? Jacob had always prided himself on being a logical person, someone who solved problems with calm deliberation. But now, in the face of this growing unease, he couldn't think clearly. His heart ached with confusion, and his mind refused to stop asking the questions he didn't want to hear the answers to. Why was she suddenly so distant? What had changed? What was she hiding from him? Jacob had always believed that a strong relationship was built on honesty and trust. But now, those values were starting to feel fragile, like the cracks in the foundation of their marriage were deepening with every passing day. He wanted to confront Lauren, to ask her about the things that were eating away at him, but a part of him feared what the truth might reveal. Was he ready to face whatever lay behind those cracks? Each day, Jacob found himself wrestling with the same questions, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, He didn't want to accuse her of something she might not have done. But as the days went on, the doubt gnawed at him more and more. He was starting to wonder if he had really known her at all. Could it be that the woman he loved had been hiding something from him all this time? Chapter 2. Torn between doubt and love. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion and inner turmoil for Jacob. Each morning, he woke up next to Lauren, but the woman beside him felt like a stranger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but at the same time, he couldn't bear the thought of confronting her. What if he was wrong? What if his suspicions were just a product of his own insecurities? His mind was a battlefield of emotions, torn between love and doubt. Jacob had always prided himself on being a man of reason, someone who kept his emotions in check, but now he found himself caught in a web of uncertainty. The more he thought about the changes in Lauren's behavior, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. But at the same time, a voice inside him urged him to wait, to give her the benefit of the doubt. He tried to focus on other things, work, his friends, his hobbies, but nothing could distract him from the gnawing feeling in his gut. He couldn't escape the thoughts of what might be happening behind the scenes, of the secrets she might be keeping. The idea of confronting Lauren haunted him, but so did the idea of staying silent, of ignoring his suspicions and pretending everything was fine. What if he was wrong? What if, after everything, Lauren was still the woman he had fallen in love with? But deep down, Jacob knew something had shifted. He could feel it in the air, in the way she looked at him sometimes, in the way she avoided certain conversations. Her smile seemed forced, her laughter hollow. There were moments when she still seemed like the woman he knew, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. He had seen the way she looked at her phone lately, how her eyes seemed to linger on messages that she quickly hid from view. He had noticed the change in her tone when they talked about their future, the subtle hints that she wasn't as invested in their life together as she once was. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He didn't want to turn into someone consumed by suspicion, someone who let doubt take over every moment of his life. And yet, the more time passed, the more Jacob's heart ached. He loved Lauren. He wanted to believe in her, to trust her. But how could he when everything in him screamed that something was wrong? The thought of losing her terrified him, but the thought of confronting her, of asking her the questions that had been building up inside him, filled him with dread. He didn't know how he would handle the truth, whatever it might be. Jacob spent sleepless nights wrestling with his thoughts, his mind unable to quiet the questions that ran through it like a river. Should he ask her outright? Should he search for the answers on his own? The decision weighed heavily on him, each day bringing more uncertainty. In the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, Jacob wondered if he would ever be able to go back to the way things were before. Would he ever be able to trust her again, even if she told him the truth? And if he didn't confront her, could he live with the doubt forever? The emotional tug-of-war was exhausting, but Jacob knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep living in limbo. The truth, whatever it was, needed to come out, and soon. This revision keeps the focus on Jacob's emotional journey, emphasizing his confusion, doubt, and internal conflict. The investigation aspect is softened and left more in the background, allowing the story to focus more on his feelings of uncertainty and the growing tension in his marriage. Chapter 6. The First Blow. Jacob's plan was taking shape. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had already made up his mind. The evidence was there, and Lauren could no longer hide behind her lies. It was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. One evening, Jacob decided to take action. Lauren had planned to meet a friend for dinner, but Jacob knew this was just another cover-up. As soon as she left, Jacob followed her at a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to see for himself. Lauren's car pulled into a parking lot downtown, and Jacob parked a few spaces away, trying to stay out of sight. He watched as she entered the restaurant, her body language tense and guarded. A few minutes later, Ryan Keller appeared, and the two of them walked into the restaurant together, laughing softly. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had always suspected it, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. His heart ached as he watched Lauren, the woman he had loved for so many years, walk into that restaurant with another man. The anger inside him surged, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was just the beginning. He took a few photos documenting the moment. He would have the proof he needed, and Lauren would have nowhere to hide. But even as he snapped the photos, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something far more precious than just his wife. Chapter 7. The House of Cards Collapses. Continue the story further with emotional and psychological confrontations between Jacob and Lauren, keeping the tone dramatic but without explicit actions. This is just the beginning of the adjustments. By maintaining the focus on emotional conflict, psychological tension, and subtle confrontation, the story will be both engaging and safe for monetization on YouTube. Let me know if you would like to continue expanding this, or if you need more changes. Banda NOI. Please continue to write. ChatGPT to NOI. Certainly. Let's continue the story from where we left off, maintaining the tone and keeping the content monetization friendly while focusing on emotional depth, tension, and psychological development. Chapter 7. The House of Cards Collapses. Jacob's hand shook slightly as he held the photos he had taken from the parking lot. They were blurry, but they were undeniable. Lauren and Ryan Keller together, just as he had feared. But despite the anger and betrayal burning inside him, something unexpected washed over him: sadness. His heart ached as he realized that the woman he had once trusted with everything was now a stranger to him. His thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between the desire for justice and the need to confront Lauren in the most calculated way possible. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the truth, unmasking the lies she had so carefully constructed. The next few days were a blur. Jacob found himself unable to focus on anything other than the plan forming in his mind. He had to make her see what she had done, to understand the full weight of her actions. But he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment. This was not about a confrontation fueled by anger. It had to be controlled, deliberate. Lauren continued to act like everything was normal. She came home from work at the usual time, made dinner, and even suggested a weekend getaway. But Jacob could see through it all now. Every word, every gesture, felt like a performance. She was trying to keep up appearances, as though nothing had changed. But Jacob knew better. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jacob watched her closely. Lauren laughed at something trivial, her eyes bright with a false sense of ease. Jacob didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the evidence he had gathered. He could feel his pulse quicken. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down on her. "You seem distant tonight," Lauren said, breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" Jacob met her gaze, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, just tired from work." But inside, his mind was working at full speed. How could he approach this without losing control? How could he confront her without making a scene? He had to be smart about it. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. As the evening wore on, Jacob retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He needed space to think, to plan. He needed to go over everything one last time before the confrontation. The photos, the phone records, the inconsistencies in her stories, it all led to the same conclusion. Lauren had betrayed him, but the question lingered in his mind. Why? Why had she done this? Was it just a moment of weakness? Or had there been something more to it? Jacob tried to push those thoughts away. He didn't need to understand her reasons right now. He just needed to expose her for what she was: a liar, a cheater, someone who had shattered the trust they had built over years. He glanced at the clock. Lauren would be going to bed soon, and it was almost time to act. Jacob took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, with the truth hanging in the air like an unbearable weight. Jacob had been patient, too patient. But tonight, everything was going to change. Lauren had gone to bed early, just like she always did after a long day of work. She was exhausted, or so she claimed, but Jacob knew better. As he walked through the dark hallway toward their bedroom, the reality of the moment settled over him like a cold fog. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his emotions in check. This was it. He pushed open the bedroom door, standing in the doorway for a moment as he watched her sleep. For a brief second, Jacob wondered what would happen if he just walked away, if he let things be, if he tried to forgive her. But then the memories flooded back, of her late nights, her distance, the betrayal he had uncovered. No, there was no turning back now. Jacob approached the bed, his footsteps silent on the carpet. As he stood beside her, he reached for the folder he had placed on the dresser earlier that evening. Inside it were all the pieces of evidence. The photos, the phone records, the messages he had carefully saved. He had gathered it all, piece by piece, to ensure that when the time came, Lauren would have nowhere to hide. With trembling hands, he opened the folder, pulling out the first photo. He turned to her, his voice steady but laced with the quiet intensity of a man who had had enough. "Lauren," he whispered. She stirred in her sleep, blinking slowly, her eyes adjusting to the light. "What is it?" she murmured, her voice groggy. Jacob held up the photo, placing it gently in front of her face. "What's this?" Lauren's eyes widened as she saw the image. A picture of her and Ryan Keller, laughing together in the restaurant parking lot. For a long moment, there was silence. Jacob could see the color drain from her face as the truth hit her like a wave. "Jacob, Lauren began, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't lie her way out of this one. "Don't," Jacob interrupted, his voice cold. "I've been watching you for weeks. Every late night, every excuse, every time you said you were somewhere you weren't. It all led to this." Lauren sat up, her hands trembling as she reached for the blanket. Her gaze darted between the photo and Jacob's face, but she couldn't find the words to explain herself. How could she? How could she justify what she had done when the evidence was staring her in the face? "You don't get to lie anymore," Jacob continued, his voice sharp, but there was a faint tremor beneath the surface. "I've seen enough." Lauren opened her mouth, as though to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion she had shown all night. She looked at Jacob with a mixture of fear and regret, but there was no redemption in her gaze. The damage had been done. Jacob stood there, watching her as she struggled to find the right words. He had spent so much time trying to make sense of it all, but now, in this moment, everything was clear. The pain, the betrayal, it was all laid bare before him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. Finally, Lauren broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." But Jacob didn't respond. He didn't need to hear her apologies. He didn't need any more excuses. "You're sorry," Jacob repeated, his voice flat. "You're sorry you got caught." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Lauren didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. She simply sat there, broken, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with a finality that could not be undone. Chapter 9: The Aftermath of Betrayal. In the days that followed, everything in the house changed. The conversation stopped, the laughter faded, and what had once been a home filled with love and comfort now felt like a cold, empty shell. Jacob didn't know what to do next. He didn't know whether he should leave or try to salvage whatever was left of their relationship. Lauren, for her part, remained distant. She didn't know how to fix what had been broken. All the love they had shared now felt like a distant memory, something that had never truly existed. The trust had been shattered, and no apology could put the pieces back together. Jacob found himself lost in his own thoughts, questioning everything. He had always believed in the strength of his marriage, in the idea that love could overcome anything. But now, the reality was too harsh to ignore. Lauren's betrayal had left a scar, one that would never fully heal. Chapter 10: A New Beginning. The final confrontation had come and gone, but Jacob still didn't have the answers he was looking for. What had driven Lauren to betray him? Was it just a lapse in judgment, or had there been something deeper at play? In the weeks that followed, Jacob chose to focus on himself. He began to rebuild his life, piece by piece, slowly regaining the confidence he had once lost. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but he was determined to move forward. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could control his future. As for Lauren, she remained a distant memory, a chapter in his life that he had closed. The scars of betrayal would always be there, but Jacob refused to let them define him. In the end, Jacob's journey wasn't about revenge or closure. It was about finding peace within himself, learning to trust again, and realizing that sometimes the hardest part of healing is simply moving on. This extended ending is monetization-friendly and keeps the focus on the psychological and emotional elements of the story without relying on explicit or overly graphic content. Let me know if you need more adjustments or changes. Banda NOI. Please continue to write. ChatGPT NOI. Sure, let's continue to build on the emotional and psychological aspects of Jacob's journey, deepening his personal growth and exploring his internal transformation after the confrontation. Chapter 11, The Path to Healing. It had been 3 months since the confrontation with Lauren. The silence that had followed the destruction of their marriage had been overwhelming. But Jacob had taken the time he needed. He threw himself into his work, focusing on the things he could control. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. His mind wasn't clouded by the chaos of his personal life. There were moments of peace, moments when the hurt didn't consume him entirely. But there were still nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what went wrong. He had been so sure that Lauren was the one, his soulmate, his partner for life. And yet all it took was a single betrayal to bring everything crashing down. Jacob had kept busy, distracting himself with the familiar routine of work and small social gatherings. It was easier this way. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep running from the past forever. He had to face it. He had to understand what had happened, not just to Lauren, but to himself. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jacob found himself at a local cafe alone with a cup of coffee. He had never been one for introspection, but in recent months, the weight of his emotions had been impossible to ignore. He began to write, pouring his thoughts into the pages of a journal he'd kept for years, a journal that had once been full of dreams for the future, for the life he and Lauren had planned together. But now it was a place for healing. Why did I let her in so completely? He wrote. Why did I ignore the signs, the little things that didn't add up? He couldn't answer those questions. The truth was he had trusted her completely. He had believed in the picture-perfect life they had built. Perhaps he had been blinded by his own expectations, by his own version of love. It was a bitter realization, but one he had to face. As he sat there, writing through the pain, something shifted in him. It wasn't anger anymore, not even sadness. It was acceptance. He had spent so much time trying to make sense of what had happened, but the truth was he might never fully understand why Lauren had chosen to betray him. All he could do now was move forward, take control of his life again. That evening, he made a decision. He would no longer allow the past to control him. He had suffered enough. It was time to reclaim his future. Chapter 12, A Step Toward Forgiveness. Jacob had always been a man of principles, and forgiveness had always been part of those principles. But in the wake of Lauren's betrayal, he hadn't known what forgiveness looked like. How could he forgive her? How could he forgive someone who had ripped apart everything they had built? But over time, Jacob realized that forgiveness wasn't about letting Lauren off the hook. It wasn't about absolving her of her mistakes. No, forgiveness was about freeing himself from the weight of resentment, from the anger that had consumed him for so long. One evening, as Jacob sat in his living room, the room filled with an odd sense of quiet, he decided to call Lauren. It had been weeks since they'd spoken, and he hadn't seen her in over a month. She had moved out shortly after the confrontation, and Jacob hadn't pushed to make contact. But now he needed closure. He needed to hear her side of things, not for her sake, but for his own. His fingers hesitated over the phone before he dialed her number. It rang twice before Lauren answered. Hello? Lauren, it's Jacob. There was a pause and then a soft sigh. Jacob, I didn't expect to hear from you. I know. I've been avoiding this call for a while. Jacob's voice was steady, though it wasn't without emotion. But I think I owe it to both of us to have one last conversation. I can't keep living like this, pretending that I don't have any questions. Lauren didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with sadness, yet there was a quiet strength to it as well. I understand, she said. I've been thinking a lot about everything. I can't undo what I've done, Jacob. I can't fix the past. Jacob nodded, though she couldn't see him. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking for some understanding. I'm asking because I need to heal. I know. I've hurt you more than I can ever apologize for. I was selfish and I took you for granted. But I've been trying to make sense of it too. I've been trying to understand why I did what I did. The honesty in her voice surprised Jacob. For the first time, he could hear the remorse, the genuine regret. It wasn't about justifying her actions anymore, it was about acknowledging them. And for some reason, that gave him a sense of peace. You didn't just hurt me, Jacob said softly. You hurt yourself too. And I think we both need to move on. We need to let go of the anger, of the bitterness. It's the only way we'll both find peace. There was silence on the other end of the line. Jacob could feel the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. It was a painful truth, but one they both had to face. I know. I've been trying, Lauren finally said. I'm sorry, Jacob. For everything. I know you are, Jacob replied. And I forgive you. Not for you, but for me. The words were heavy, but they were freeing. Jacob knew that forgiveness didn't mean he had to forget or excuse what had happened, but it meant that he was no longer going to let it define him. He was no longer going to let it consume him. I hope you find happiness, Lauren, he said quietly. And I hope you find peace too. Lauren's voice cracked as she replied, I hope the same for you, Jacob. With those words, the conversation ended, but it wasn't the end of their story. It was simply a chapter that had finally closed. Jacob knew that there would always be a part of him that carried the weight of their marriage, but that weight was no longer a burden, it was just a part of his past. Chapter 13, Rebuilding from the Ashes. The following months were transformative for Jacob. He threw himself into new experiences, rediscovering who he was without the shadow of his old life hanging over him. He traveled to places he had always wanted to see, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time doing the things he loved, things that had taken a backseat during his marriage. He started working out more, going on long hikes, and exploring new hobbies. The physical and emotional distance from the pain of the past gave him the clarity he needed to fully heal. And slowly he felt the grip of anger and bitterness slip away. It was in this newfound sense of freedom that Jacob realized something else. He was ready for a new beginning. Not just in his relationships, but in life itself. He didn't need to seek validation from others or from the past. He had everything he needed inside him: strength, resilience, and the ability to love again, even if that love was different than it once was. One afternoon, as he sat on the balcony of his apartment overlooking the city, Jacob smiled. He was at peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was only calm. It had taken a long time, but Jacob finally understood. The pain of betrayal was a lesson in disguise, a lesson that had taught him his own strength and the importance of moving forward. And as he looked out at the horizon, Jacob knew that the future was full of possibilities, his possibilities. This was just the beginning. Chapter 14. Embracing New Beginnings. It had been nearly 6 months since the phone call with Lauren. And in those months, Jacob had transformed in ways he hadn't thought possible. The bitterness, the anger, the confusion, he had let it all go. It wasn't that he had forgotten about the betrayal, but rather that he had learned to stop letting it define him. His life was different now. No longer haunted by the ghosts of a broken marriage, Jacob had started to rebuild. He moved to a new apartment in a quieter part of Austin, a place where he could think and breathe without the weight of memories bearing down on him. The walls of his old house, now an empty reminder of what he had lost, were no longer part of his world. His new space was minimalistic, with a few pieces of furniture he had hand-picked himself. There were no traces of Lauren, no photographs or mementos of their life together. It was a clean slate, a place where Jacob could truly begin again. One evening, as he sat on the couch sipping his coffee, Jacob gazed out the window, watching the city light up as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was warm, but there was a coolness in his heart that made him feel balanced, at peace. He had learned to find contentment in the silence. But just as everything seemed to settle, something unexpected happened. It started with a message. Hey Jacob, I know it's been a while, but I wanted to check in on you. Hope you're doing okay. Sarah, his old college friend. They had lost touch over the years, as often happens with time, but recently, they had reconnected on social media. They'd had a few casual chats, reminiscing about old times, but nothing more than friendly exchanges. He hadn't expected to hear from her, especially not like this. He hesitated before replying, unsure of how he felt. It had been a long time since he had entertained the idea of dating again, but something in Sarah's message felt genuine, like she was truly concerned about him. She knew about his past, at least the basics, and that was enough. No pretenses, no need for small talk. Thanks, Sarah. It's been a journey, but I'm doing much better now. How about you? The response came quickly. Good to hear. Things are pretty good on my end. I've been thinking, I'm in town for a few days, and I was wondering if you'd want to grab a coffee sometime, just to catch up. Jacob smiled to himself. It had been a while since he had felt any kind of spark, but something about the simplicity of the message felt comfortable. There were no high expectations, no drama, just a chance to reconnect with someone from his past. Sure, I'd like that. Let me know when and where. They agreed to meet at a cozy little cafe downtown, one that Jacob used to frequent back when he was in college. It felt like a small yet significant step, like he was opening a door to a new chapter. The day of their meeting arrived, and Jacob found himself feeling unexpectedly nervous. It wasn't that he was afraid of seeing Sarah. It was the uncertainty, the fear of starting over, of trusting again, of opening himself up to someone else. The scars of his past were still fresh, even though he had healed so much. The idea of vulnerability, of risking his heart again, was a daunting thought. When Sarah walked into the cafe, Jacob couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. She looked the same in many ways, still vibrant, still that easygoing, confident person he had once admired. But there was something different about her now, too. Maybe it was the warmth in her eyes, or the way she smiled when she saw him. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness. It was as if time had melted away. "Jacob!" she exclaimed, walking toward him with open arms. "It's so good to see you." He stood up to hug her, a little taken aback by the genuine enthusiasm in her voice. "You too, Sarah. It's been a while." They sat down, and for the next few hours they caught up on life. They talked about their careers, their travels, their mutual friends, and all the little things that made life interesting. There was no mention of the past, no heavy conversations about relationships or failed marriages. It was just two old friends reconnecting, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob found himself laughing and genuinely enjoying someone's company. As the conversation turned lighter, Sarah asked, "So, what's next for you, Jacob? I mean, after everything that happened with Lauren." Jacob stiffened slightly but quickly relaxed. He had learned not to dwell on the past, but hearing her ask about it stirred something inside him. He didn't want to get into the specifics of his pain, of his betrayal, but he also didn't want to hide it from Sarah. She deserved to know the truth, at least the version of it that was relevant now. "I've moved on, Sarah," Jacob said quietly. "I've done a lot of soul-searching, and honestly, I'm better for it. It wasn't easy, but I've learned a lot about myself. I'm in a much better place now." Sarah smiled warmly, her eyes softening with understanding. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be happy, Jacob." The conversation flowed effortlessly after that. They talked about their mutual love for travel, and Sarah mentioned how she had taken a solo trip to Europe last year. Jacob found himself intrigued by her stories, and as they parted ways later that evening, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Chapter 15. The Art of Trusting Again. Jacob had been cautious about opening up to Sarah, but over the next few weeks, they continued to meet. Their connection deepened, not in any grand, dramatic way, but in the subtle, quiet moments of understanding. They talked more, laughed more, and shared the parts of their lives that they hadn't shared with anyone else. Sarah was patient with him, never rushing him, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. In those weeks, Jacob began to learn what it meant to trust again. Not just in others, but in himself. He had spent so much time in the past feeling betrayed and hurt that it had been difficult to believe in the goodness of people. But Sarah had shown him that trust could be built again, step by step, slowly but surely. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street after dinner, Jacob turned to her and said, "You know, I never thought I'd be in this place again. I didn't think I'd ever be able to trust someone after what happened with Lauren." Sarah looked at him, her expression gentle. "Trust is a hard thing, Jacob, but I think you're ready to trust again. You just have to be willing to take it one step at a time." Jacob nodded, taking in her words. For the first time in months, he felt like he was moving forward, not just with his life, but with his heart. He didn't know what the future held, or if he would ever fall in love again. But for the first time, he felt like he was open to the possibility. As they stood there, under the dim light of the street lamp, Jacob realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know exactly what would happen next. All he needed was the courage to keep moving forward, to keep trusting, and to keep loving. and for the first time in a long time he was ready.